The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Sarah Mitchell pushed the metal cart through the narrow corridors of Naval Station Norfolk. At 38, she had perfected the art of being invisible. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a regulation bun. Her uniform was always pressed, but never stood out, and her movements were efficient but unremarkable. For the past 8 years, she had been the kind of employee supervisors loved, but never really noticed, reliable, quiet, and completely predictable. Her job title was ammunition technician, which sounded more impressive than it actually was. Most days, Sarah spent her time organizing supplies, updating inventory records, and making sure the right equipment got to the right places at the right times. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and steady was exactly what Sarah needed. She had built her entire life around being steady. The morning of September 15th started like any other. Sarah clocked in at 0630, grabbed her first cup of coffee from the break room, and reviewed the day's assignment sheet. Storage room C needed a complete reorganization. Someone had requested an audit of the facility's older ammunition storage areas, and Sarah had volunteered for the job. While her colleagues groaned about the dusty, cramped spaces and the heavy lifting involved, Sarah actually preferred this kind of work. It meant she could work alone, without small talk or questions about her personal life. Storage room C sat in the basement level of Building 47, a concrete structure that had been built during World War II and still carried the musty smell of decades. The room was larger than most people expected, stretching back into shadows that the overhead lights never quite reached. Metal shelving units lined the walls, stacked floor to ceiling with wooden crates, metal containers, and filing boxes that chronicled nearly 50 years of military operations. Sarah wheeled her cart inside and surveyed the task ahead. The previous organization system, if it could be called that, seemed to follow no logical pattern. Boxes from the 1970s sat next to containers marked with recent dates. Supply records were mixed with personnel files. It would take her at least 3 days to sort through everything properly. She started with the shelving unit closest to the door, working methodically from left to right. Each container needed to be opened, cataloged, and sorted into the appropriate category. Some boxes contained outdated ammunition that would need to be disposed of through proper channels. Others held spare parts for weapons systems that hadn't been used in decades. A few contained training materials and technical manuals that might still have value. By noon, Sarah had worked her way through 2 complete shelving units. Her back ached from lifting heavy boxes, and dust had settled into every fold of her uniform. She took a short break for lunch, eating her sandwich alone in the storage room rather than joining the crowd in the cafeteria. The solitude felt comfortable, familiar. When she returned to work, Sarah moved to the back section of the room, where the shadows were deeper and the dust was thicker. These boxes looked older than the others, and many bore labels in faded ink that was difficult to read. Some containers seemed to have been forgotten entirely, pushed back against the rear wall where they had accumulated years of neglect. It was while moving a particularly heavy wooden crate that Sarah discovered the loose floorboard. The crate's weight had shifted unexpectedly, and when she set it down, she heard a hollow sound that didn't match the solid concrete floor she expected. Kneeling down, she ran her fingers along the edges of what appeared to be a wooden panel set into the concrete. The panel was approximately 2 feet square and seemed to have been cut into the floor sometime after the original construction. Sarah looked around the storage room, suddenly aware that she might have stumbled onto something that wasn't meant to be found. The logical thing to do would be to report the discovery to her supervisor and let someone else investigate. But something about the hidden panel intrigued her. In 8 years of working in various storage facilities, she had never encountered anything like this. Using a screwdriver from her toolkit, Sarah carefully pried up the edges of the wooden panel. It came free with surprising ease, as if it had been designed to be opened. Beneath the panel was a metal box, painted military green and bearing no identifying marks. The box was roughly the size of a briefcase and felt substantial, but not overwhelmingly heavy when Sarah lifted it from its hiding place. Her heart was beating faster now, though she couldn't say exactly why. The rational part of her mind insisted that the box probably contained old paperwork or obsolete equipment. But The way it had been hidden suggested something more significant. Someone had taken considerable effort to conceal this container, and that level of secrecy usually meant the contents were important. Sarah carried the metal box to her cart and positioned it so she could examine it more closely under the overhead lights. The box was secured with a simple latch mechanism, but there was no lock. When she pressed the release, the latch opened with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet storage room. Inside the box, wrapped in protective cloth, was a collection of items that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Military medals lay carefully arranged in presentation cases, their ribbons still bright despite what appeared to be years of storage. Combat decorations, service ribbons, and commendation medals filled the upper section of the box. But it was the items in the lower compartment that caused Sarah's hands to tremble. Photographs showed a young woman in military uniform standing with various groups of soldiers. The woman looked familiar, though Sarah couldn't immediately place where she might have seen her before. Combat reports, typed on official letterhead, described actions taken during operations in locations Sarah recognized from news reports. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a separate piece of cloth, was a single medal that Sarah had only seen in history books. The Congressional Medal of Honor. Sarah stared at the medal for a long time, trying to process what she was looking at. The Medal of Honor was the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government, reserved for service members who displayed extraordinary heroism in combat. She had read about Medal of Honor recipients during her military training, but she had never seen the actual medal in person. The bronze star suspended from its blue ribbon seemed to capture and reflect the storage room's harsh fluorescent lighting. But what confused Sarah more than finding the medal was the question of why it was hidden. Medal of Honor recipients were celebrated throughout the military. Their names were known, their stories were told, and their achievements were recorded in official histories. Why would someone conceal such an important recognition? Sarah picked up one of the photographs to examine it more closely. The young woman in the center of the image was wearing dress uniform and standing between two older officers. The setting appeared to be some kind of formal ceremony, though Sarah couldn't identify the specific occasion. The woman's face was partially obscured by the angle of the photograph, but something about her features seemed familiar. It was when Sarah turned the photograph over that she found the handwritten notation that changed everything. In careful block letters, someone had written, Lieutenant Sarah J. Mitchell, Medal of Honor Ceremony, Classified Operation, March 15, 1999. Sarah's hands began to shake as she read the words again. The name was her name, though she had never held the rank of lieutenant and had certainly never received the Medal of Honor. But the date meant something to her. March 15th, 1999, was a date she had spent years trying to forget, a date connected to events she rarely allowed herself to remember. She set the photograph down and picked up one of the combat reports. The document was heavily redacted, with large sections blacked out by censoring marks. But the portions she could read described a military operation in a location she recognized, an operation she had been part of as a much younger woman serving in a very different capacity than her current role suggested. Sarah's breathing became rapid and shallow as memories she had carefully buried began to surface. Images flashed through her mind. A convoy under attack, explosions that seemed to go on forever, the weight of injured soldiers she had carried to safety. She had spent years in therapy learning to manage these memories, learning to build walls around them so they wouldn't overwhelm her daily life. But now, sitting in a dusty storage room with evidence of events she had never spoken about, those walls were beginning to crumble. The woman in the photographs was her, though it felt like looking at a stranger. The name on the combat reports was her name, though the actions described seemed like something that had happened to someone else. Sarah realized she was crying, though she couldn't say when the tears had started. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and tried to focus on practical concerns. Someone had hidden these items for a reason. Someone had taken considerable care to ensure they wouldn't be discovered accidentally. And someone had knowledge of events that Sarah had been told were classified at the highest levels of government. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside storage room caused Sarah to freeze. She quickly wiped her eyes again and tried to arrange the items back in the metal box the way she had found them. But Her hands were still shaking, and she fumbled with one of the metal cases, which fell to the floor with a sharp clatter. The footsteps stopped outside the storage room door. Sarah held her breath, hoping whoever was in the corridor would continue walking. Instead, she heard the unmistakable sound of the door handle turning. "Everything all right in here?" The voice belonged to Chief Petty Officer Martinez, one of the facility supervisors who occasionally checked on workers in the isolated storage areas. "Fine, Chief," Sarah called back. Tried to keep her voice steady. "Just dropped something while I was reorganizing. You've been down here for hours, Mitchell. Maybe you should take a longer break, get some fresh air." "I'm almost finished with this section," Sarah replied. "I'd like to complete it before the end of the day, if possible." She heard Martinez's footsteps continue down the corridor, and she released the breath she had been holding. But the interruption had reminded her that she wasn't actually alone in the building, and that her discovery needed to be handled carefully. She couldn't simply pretend she had never found the hidden box, but she also couldn't ignore the implications of what it contained. Sarah looked at her watch and realized that more than an hour had passed since she had first opened the metal container. The afternoon shift would be ending soon, and the storage area would become even more isolated. She needed to make a decision about what to do with her discovery. Part of her wanted to put everything back in a hidden compartment and pretend she had never found it. Her current life was built on stability and predictability, and whatever was in this box threatened to disrupt that carefully constructed piece. But another part of her, a part she had thought was long dead, was curious about the truth behind these hidden items. Sarah carefully examined each item one more time, trying to piece together a story that made sense. The photographs, the combat reports, and the medals painted a picture of military service that she didn't remember agreeing to publicize. Her memories of the events described in the reports were fragmented and painful, but they were definitely her memories. The woman in the photographs was definitely her, though she looked younger and somehow different than she remembered feeling at the time. What confused her most was the Medal of Honor itself. She had no memory of receiving such an award, and she was certain she would remember something that's significant. Medal of Honor ceremonies were major events, attended by high-ranking officials and often covered by news media. There was no way she could have forgotten participating in such a ceremony, unless the ceremony had never happened, unless the medal had been awarded but never presented, unless the entire operation, including recognition for her actions, had been classified at a level that required complete secrecy. Sarah had heard rumors during her earlier military service about operations that were so sensitive they were essentially erased from official records. Soldiers who participated in such missions sometimes found that their service records had been altered, their awards had been classified, and their contributions had been officially forgotten. It was a price some service members paid for participating in operations that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. As she considered this possibility, Sarah began to understand why the box had been hidden. If her actions during the March 15th, 1999 operation had been classified, then any recognition for those actions would also be classified. The Medal of Honor in the box might be real, but it could never be publicly acknowledged. It would exist only as a secret recognition of secret heroism. But that still didn't explain how the box had ended up hidden in storage room C, or who had put it there. Sarah examined the wooden panel that had concealed the hiding place, and noticed that the wood appeared to be newer than the surrounding concrete floor. Someone had created this hiding place relatively recently, probably within the last few years. Sarah made her decision. She carefully placed all the items back in the metal box, arranged exactly as she had found them. She secured the latch and placed the box back in the hidden compartment beneath the loose floorboard. Then, she positioned the wooden panel back in place and moved the heavy wooden crate over it to conceal any evidence of her discovery. But before sealing everything away, Sarah used her phone to take pictures of several items. She photographed the Medal of Honor, 2 of the combat reports, and the photograph with her name written on the back. She wasn't sure what she planned to do with these images, but something told her she might need evidence of what she had found. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Sarah went through the motions of organizing the remaining boxes and updating her inventory records, but her mind was focused entirely on the hidden box and its implications for her carefully constructed life. By the time she clocked out at 16:30, she had made another decision. She was going to find out the truth about what had happened during the March 15th, 1999 operation, and she was going to discover who had hidden the evidence of her involvement. Whatever the consequences might be for her current life, she needed to understand why someone thought her actions deserved the highest military honor, and why that honor had been kept secret for more than 20 years. As Sarah walked to her car in the parking lot, she didn't notice the figure watching her from the window of Building 47's third floor. Admiral Catherine Reynolds had been observing the storage room reorganization project through security cameras, and she had seen everything that had happened in Storage Room C that afternoon. Admiral Reynolds had been waiting 23 years for someone to find the hidden box. She had put it there herself, shortly after taking command of the station, because she believed that some secrets were too important to remain buried forever. Now, finally, the right person had found it. The person who deserved to know the truth about her own heroism. Sarah spent that evening in her small apartment, staring at the photographs on her phone and trying to remember details about March 15th, 1999. The memories came in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered and left to gather dust. She remembered the heat of the desert, the weight of her equipment, and the sound of helicopters overhead. But the specific details remained frustratingly unclear. Her apartment reflected the same careful simplicity as her work life. Clean lines, neutral colors, and nothing that drew attention to itself. The only personal touches were a few books on the shelves and a single photograph on the side table, a picture of her parents taken years before they had died in a car accident. Sarah had learned early that the safest way to live was to avoid attachments that could be lost or relationships that could disappoint. She made herself dinner, though she barely tasted it, and tried to focus on routine activities that might help her process what she had discovered. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw that Medal of Honor lying in its presentation case. And every time she looked at her phone, the photograph of the young woman in military uniform seemed to be staring back at her. By 10 o'clock, Sarah had convinced herself that she was probably overreacting. The box might contain items related to someone else entirely. The notation on the photograph might be a mistake. The resemblance between herself and the woman in the pictures might be coincidental. Memory was notoriously unreliable, especially when it came to traumatic events, and Sarah knew she had experienced trauma during her military service. But even as she tried to rationalize away her discovery, Sarah found herself researching Medal of Honor recipients from 1999 on her laptop. The official records showed no recipient named Sarah Mitchell, which wasn't surprising if the award had been classified. What did surprise her was how few women had received the Medal of Honor throughout military history, and how much attention each recipient typically received. If she had actually been awarded such recognition, the secrecy surrounding it must have been extraordinary. Sarah went to bed that night with more questions than answers, but she was determined to put the incident behind her and return to her normal routine. She had spent 8 years building a stable life, and she wasn't going to let one afternoon's discovery disrupt that stability. Her plans for normalcy lasted exactly until 0800 the next morning, when Chief Petty Officer Martinez appeared at her workstation with an expression that immediately put Sarah on alert. "Mitchell, you need to report to Admiral Reynolds' office immediately," Martinez said. His usual casual demeanor had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like nervousness. Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Admiral Reynolds? I don't understand. Did I do something wrong with the storage room inventory?" "I don't know anything about it," Martinez replied. "I just got a call from her aide saying you were needed upstairs right away." "And Mitchell?" He paused, looking uncomfortable. When an admiral calls, you don't keep her waiting. Sarah had never met Admiral Reynolds personally, though she had seen her around the base occasionally. Catherine Reynolds was a legend in the Navy, one of the first women to achieve flag rank, and known for her brilliant strategic mind and uncompromising standards. She was exactly the kind of officer Sarah had always avoided dealing with. Too senior, too intimidating, and too likely to ask uncomfortable questions. The elevator ride to the third floor seemed to take forever. Sarah tried to prepare herself for whatever had prompted the Admiral's summons, but She couldn't think of anything she had done recently that would warrant attention from such a high-ranking officer. Her work was always completed on time and according to specifications. She had never been written up for disciplinary issues. She had deliberately maintained the lowest possible profile. Admiral Reynolds' office was located at the end of a corridor lined with photographs of naval operations and portraits of distinguished officers. Sarah had never been in this part of the building before, and the formal atmosphere made her feel increasingly nervous. When she reached the outer office, the Admiral's aide, a young lieutenant commander, looked up from his computer with a polite smile. "Petty Officer Mitchell, Admiral Reynolds is expecting you. Please go right in." Sarah knocked on the office door and heard a crisp voice call, "Enter." When she stepped inside, she found herself face to face with one of the most powerful women in the United States Navy. Admiral Catherine Reynolds was in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a regulation style and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything. She wore dress blues with rows of ribbons that testified to decades of distinguished service. But what struck Sarah most was the intelligence in the Admiral's gaze. This was clearly someone who missed very little and forgot even less. "Petty Officer Mitchell," Admiral Reynolds said, standing up from behind her desk. "Please have a seat. We have quite a bit to discuss." Sarah remained standing and came to attention. "Ma'am, I'm not sure why I've been called here." "If there's a problem with my work, at ease, Petty Officer," the Admiral interrupted. "This isn't about your current work performance, which I understand has been exemplary. This is about something much more important than inventory management." Admiral Reynolds moved around her desk and gestured to a sitting area near the windows, where two comfortable chairs faced each other across a small coffee table. The informal setting somehow made Sarah feel more nervous rather than less. "Please sit down," the Admiral said again, "and close the door behind you. What we're about to discuss is classified." Sarah's mouth went dry as she followed the Admiral's instructions. The mention of classified information could only mean one thing. Somehow, Admiral Reynolds knew about her discovery in Storage Room C. "Ma'am," Sarah began carefully, "if this is about the storage room inventory, I can explain." Admiral Reynolds held up a hand. "Mitchell, let me start by telling you something that might surprise you. I've been waiting for you to find that box for almost 3 years." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at the Admiral, trying to process what she had just heard. "You've been waiting for me to find it. I placed it there myself," Admiral Reynolds said calmly. "In 2021, when I took command of this station, I knew that eventually the storage rooms would need to be reorganized, and I knew that you were the kind of person who would be assigned to that task. I also knew that you were the only person who had the right to know what was in that box." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand the implications. "You put the box there? But why? And how did you know about?" She stopped, unable to finish the question. "About March 15th, 1999? Admiral Reynolds asked. "About Operation Silent Thunder? About what you did that day that saved 47 American lives and prevented an international incident that could have destabilized the entire region." The room seemed to spin around Sarah. She gripped the arms of her chair and tried to steady herself. "I don't understand. That operation was classified. Everything about it was supposed to be erased from official records." "Almost everything," Admiral Reynolds corrected. "But not everything. Some records were preserved, kept in the most secure files possible, because what happened that day was too important to be completely forgotten. And because the people involved deserve to have their heroism acknowledged, even if it could never be publicly recognized." Admiral Reynolds stood up and walked to a filing cabinet behind her desk. She removed a thick folder marked with classification levels Sarah had never seen before and returned to the sitting area. "Let me tell you what really happened on March 15th, 1999, the Admiral said. "And let me tell you why you deserve that Medal of Honor, even though you never receive it officially." Sarah felt tears starting in her eyes. For 23 years, she had carried fragments of memories that felt too terrible and too heroic to be real. For 23 years, she had convinced herself that her recollections were exaggerated, that trauma had made her remember events as more significant than they actually were. "I was just a corpsman," Sarah whispered. "I was there to provide medical support. I wasn't supposed to be involved in combat operations." Admiral Reynolds opened the folder and removed several photographs. Sarah recognized them immediately. They were clearer versions of some of the images she had seen in the hidden box, showing her in military uniform, standing with groups of soldiers. You were assigned as a corpsman to a joint special operations team, Admiral Reynolds explained. The mission was supposed to be routine, insertion into a hostile area to extract intelligence assets. But the intelligence was wrong. Instead of finding a small group of operatives waiting for pickup, your team walked into an ambush that had been planned for weeks. The Admiral's words triggered more vivid memories. Sarah remembered the sudden explosion of gunfire, the confusion as the team took cover behind inadequate shelter, and the growing realization that they were vastly outnumbered. The team leader was killed in the first minutes of the firefight, Admiral Reynolds continued. The communications specialist was wounded and unable to establish contact with support units. Half the team was pinned down by enemy fire, and the extraction helicopters couldn't land because of the hostile activity. Sarah closed her eyes and let the memories flow. She remembered the moment when she realized that waiting for rescue wasn't an option, that someone needed to take action or everyone was going to die in that desert. You took command, Admiral Reynolds said softly. A Navy corpsman with no formal combat leadership training took command of a special operations team because you were the only one who could see a way out of the situation. I had medical training, Sarah said, opening her eyes. I knew how to treat the wounded soldiers. But I also knew that if we stayed where we were, everyone was going to bleed out before help could arrive. So what did you do? The question unlocked memories that Sarah had buried so deeply she had almost convinced herself they belonged to someone else. She remembered crawling through enemy fire to reach the wounded communications specialist. She remembered using the radio equipment she wasn't supposed to know how to operate to call for support. She remembered organizing the surviving team members into a defensive position while simultaneously treating the injured. I called in air support, Sarah said slowly. But the jets couldn't attack without ground coordination. Someone needed to get close enough to the enemy positions to provide targeting information. Admiral Reynolds nodded. And who volunteered for that mission? I did. The admission came out as barely a whisper. I took the targeting equipment and crawled through 300 yards of open terrain while the team provided covering fire. I spent 40 minutes directing airstrikes while lying in a drainage ditch with enemy soldiers shooting over my head. And then, Sarah's voice grew stronger as the memories became clearer. After the airstrikes eliminated the main enemy positions, I organized the team to move to the extraction point. But we still had wounded soldiers who couldn't walk, and the enemy had backup units moving toward our position. Someone needed to stay behind to cover the evacuation. Who stayed behind? I did. I stayed behind with 2 other volunteers, and we held the position until the helicopters could get everyone else out safely. Sarah paused, remembering the weight of that decision. We didn't know if there would be room for us on the last helicopter. We didn't know if the last helicopter would even make it to the extraction point. Admiral Reynolds reached into the folder and removed a document that Sarah recognized as an after-action report. According to the official records, your actions that day saved 47 American lives. You took command of a compromised special operations mission, called in air support, directed precision strikes against enemy positions, organized a tactical withdrawal under fire, and volunteered to stay behind to ensure the successful evacuation of wounded soldiers. Sarah stared at the document without really seeing it. She remembered the feeling of the last helicopter lifting off with her aboard, the overwhelming relief of being alive, and the strange emptiness that followed. She remembered being debriefed by officers whose names she never learned, and being told that nothing that had happened could ever be discussed with anyone. Why was it classified? Sarah asked. I understand that special operations are sensitive, but why was the recognition classified as well? Admiral Reynolds' expression grew more serious. Because Operation Silent Thunder wasn't just a rescue mission. The intelligence assets you were supposed to extract had discovered evidence of weapons transfers between hostile nations. The enemy forces that ambushed your team were acting on orders from foreign military commanders who couldn't be officially identified without causing a diplomatic crisis. Sarah began to understand. So, acknowledging what happened would have required acknowledging what the mission was really about. Exactly. Your heroism became a casualty of international politics. The Medal of Honor was approved at the highest levels of government, but it could never be presented because the mission it recognized could never be officially acknowledged. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that her memories were real, anger that her sacrifices had been hidden, and confusion about why she was learning this now. Admiral, I appreciate you telling me the truth about what happened, but I don't understand why you're revealing this now. If the operation was classified then, why isn't it classified now? Admiral Reynolds smiled for the first time since their conversation had begun. Because the geopolitical situation that required the secrecy no longer exists. The foreign governments involved have changed. The weapons transfer program was exposed through other means years ago, and the strategic value of keeping Operation Silent Thunder classified has diminished significantly. She paused and leaned forward slightly. More importantly, because you deserve to know the truth about your own heroism. You spent 23 years thinking you were just a medical technician who got lucky during a bad situation. You deserve to know that you were actually a hero who saved dozens of lives through extraordinary courage and tactical skill. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, feeling emotions she had suppressed for decades finally surfacing. But I'm not a hero, Admiral. I'm just someone who works in supply management now. I organize ammunition boxes and update inventory records. I'm nobody special. Admiral Reynolds stood up and walked to the window overlooking the base. Mitchell, let me ask you something. In the 8 years you've worked at this station, how many times have you volunteered for the difficult assignments that other people avoid? Sarah thought about the question. That's just because I prefer working alone. How many times have you stayed late to help other departments meet their deadlines? That's just because I don't have many obligations outside of work. Admiral Reynolds turned back to face her. How many times have you identified problems in supply chains that could have affected operational readiness? Sarah was quiet for a moment. I just noticed things that don't seem right. And how many times have you recommended changes to procedures that have improved efficiency and safety? Those were just suggestions based on what I observed during my daily work. Admiral Reynolds returned to her chair and looked directly at Sarah. Mitchell, heroism isn't something that only happens during combat operations. Heroism is a pattern of behavior that puts service before self and mission before personal comfort. You didn't stop being a hero when you left special operations. You just applied your heroism to different challenges. Sarah struggled to accept the Admiral's perspective. For so many years, she had seen her current life as a retreat from significance, a way to hide from the responsibilities and dangers that had defined her earlier military service. Admiral, I appreciate what you're saying, but I chose this assignment specifically because it was low profile and low risk. I wanted a quiet life where I could do good work without being noticed. And do you think choosing a quiet life diminishes the value of the courage you showed during Operation Silent Thunder? Sarah considered the question carefully. I suppose not, but it feels like I was a different person then. I'm not sure I could do those things again if I had to. Admiral Reynolds smiled again. Mitchell, courage isn't about being unafraid. Courage is about acting appropriately despite fear. The fact that you're frightened by the prospect of returning to high-risk situations doesn't make you less courageous. It makes you human. She picked up the folder and removed one final document, an official-looking certificate with elaborate borders and formal language. This is the citation that was written to accompany your Medal of Honor. It was signed by the Secretary of Defense and approved by the President, but it was never officially presented because of the classification issues we discussed. Sarah took the document with trembling hands and read the formal language that described her actions on March 15, 1999. Seeing her heroism described in official terms made it feel more real than her own memories had. Admiral, Sarah said slowly, what happens now? Why are you showing me this? Are you asking me to return to special operations? No, Michi. I'm not asking you to change anything about your current life or your current assignment. I'm simply asking you to understand that your past heroism was real, that it mattered, and that it's part of who you are whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. Admiral Reynolds paused and seemed to consider her next words carefully. But I am asking you to consider one possibility. Your experience, both in special operations and in your current assignment, has given you a unique perspective on military operations and logistics. There might be ways for you to contribute to mission readiness that go beyond organizing ammunition boxes. Sarah felt a familiar fear rising in her chest. The fear of being asked to do more than she felt capable of doing, of being thrust back into situations where her decisions could mean life or death for other people. Admiral, I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of responsibility. I'm not asking you to make any decisions today, Mitchell. I'm simply asking you to think about the possibility that your heroism might have applications beyond combat situations. Sometimes the most important contributions happen in quiet places where nobody is watching. Admiral Reynolds stood up, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. Take some time to process what we've discussed. Think about what you learned about yourself and about what you might want to do with that knowledge. We'll talk again soon. Sarah stood as well, still clutching the citation and trying to absorb everything she had learned. As she reached the door, Admiral Reynolds called her name. Mitchell, one more thing. That Medal of Honor in the box you found, it's yours. It always was yours. Whether you choose to claim it officially or not is up to you, but it belongs to you. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and left the Admiral's office. As she walked back toward the elevator, her mind was spinning with implications and possibilities she wasn't sure she was ready to consider. But for the first time in 23 years, Sarah Mitchell was beginning to remember who she really was. Sarah spent the next 3 days in a state of emotional confusion that she hadn't experienced since the months immediately following her discharge from active duty. The conversation with Admiral Reynolds had unlocked not just memories of Operation Silent Thunder, but a flood of recollections about the person she had been before she decided to become invisible. She found herself remembering moments from her early military training when instructors had singled her out for leadership potential. She remembered the pride she had felt when she was selected for specialized medical training and, later, when she was assigned to work with special operations units. Most clearly, she remembered the sense of purpose that had driven her to push herself beyond what she thought was possible. That woman seemed like a stranger now. The woman who currently worked in supply management had spent 8 years perfecting the art of being overlooked. She arrived at work on time, completed her assignments efficiently, and left promptly at the end of her shift. She had friendly but superficial relationships with her colleagues, a clean but impersonal apartment, and hobbies that required no interaction with other people. It was a life carefully designed to minimize risk, responsibility, and the possibility of disappointing anyone. But the discovery of the Medal of Honor had cracked the foundation of that carefully constructed existence. Sarah found herself questioning choices she had made years earlier, wondering about paths she had deliberately chosen not to take, and considering possibilities she had trained herself to ignore. On Thursday morning, Sarah returned to Storage Room C to complete the inventory project she had started earlier in the week. But when she moved the wooden crate aside to check the hidden compartment, she found that the metal box was gone. In its place was a handwritten note, "Your office when you're ready. CR." Sarah stared at the note for several minutes, trying to decide how she felt about Admiral Reynolds removing the box. Part of her was relieved. The burden of keeping such an enormous secret had been weighing on her more heavily than she wanted to admit. But another part of her felt like something important had been taken away before she was ready to let go of it. She folded the note and put it in her pocket, then spent the rest of the morning mechanically completing her inventory duties. But her concentration was elsewhere, focused on the growing realization that her carefully ordered life was about to change whether she wanted it to or not. At lunch, instead of eating alone in the storage room as she usually did, Sarah found herself walking across the base toward Building 12, where the base medical facility was located. She hadn't been inside the medical building since her initial assignment physical 8 years earlier, but something about her conversation with Admiral Reynolds had reminded her of the satisfaction she had once found in medical work. The building's interior was bright and modern, very different from the cramped storage areas where Sarah usually worked. Medical personnel moved through the corridors with a kind of purposeful energy that Sarah remembered from her own medical training. The environment felt familiar in a way that her current workplace never had. Sarah approached the information desk and asked to speak with the chief medical officer. She wasn't sure what she planned to say, but she felt compelled to explore whether her medical background might still have value. Commander Patricia Williams was a woman in her early 50s who radiated the competence and calm authority that Sarah associated with senior medical officers. When Sarah explained that she was a former Navy corpsman currently working in supply management, Commander Williams invited her to sit down and discuss her background. "How long since you've practiced medicine?" Petty Officer Mitchell. Commander Williams asked after Sarah had provided a brief summary of her training and experience. "About 8 years, ma'am. I transitioned to supply management when I was assigned to this station." "Any particular reason for the career change?" Sarah hesitated, not sure how much of her personal history she wanted to share. "I felt like I needed something less demanding at the time. Supply work seemed like a good fit for my organizational skills." Commander Williams studied Sarah's personnel file, which she had requested while they talked. "Your medical training records are impressive. Advanced trauma care, field medicine, specialized procedures. This level of training represents a significant investment by the Navy. It seems like a waste to have someone with your qualifications organizing supplies." "I've been happy with my current assignment," Sarah said, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were still true. "I'm sure you have been. But happiness and fulfillment aren't necessarily the same thing." Commander Williams closed the file and leaned forward. "Mitchell, we're currently understaffed in several areas, particularly trauma care and emergency response. Would you be interested in discussing opportunities to return to medical duties?" Sarah felt her heart rate increase. The prospect of returning to medical work was both exciting and terrifying. "I would need significant retraining. It's been 8 years since I've treated patients." "Of course, we would expect to provide refresher training and certification updates. The question is whether you have interest in pursuing that path." Sarah thought about the satisfaction she had once found in medical work, the immediate, tangible way she could help people, the technical challenges that required both knowledge and intuition, and the sense of being part of something larger than herself. "I think I might be interested," Sarah said carefully. "But I would need to understand what kinds of responsibilities would be involved." Commander Williams smiled. "Why don't I arrange for you to spend a day observing our emergency medical unit? You could see what our current operations look like and decide whether it appeals to you." Sarah agreed to the observation visit and left the medical building feeling more energized than she had in months. The possibility of returning to medical work awakened something in her that she had almost forgotten existed, a sense of professional purpose that went beyond simply completing assigned tasks. That evening, Sarah found herself thinking about Admiral Reynolds' suggestion that there might be ways for her to contribute to mission readiness beyond her current duties. The conversation with Commander Williams had shown her one possible direction, but Sarah suspected that Admiral Reynolds had something different in mind. On Friday morning, Sarah received a message asking her to report to Admiral Reynolds' office again. This time, she felt less nervous and more curious about what the Admiral wanted to discuss. When she entered the office, Sarah found Admiral Reynolds reviewing what appeared to be personnel files. The metal box from storage room C sat on the desk, its contents spread across the surface in organized arrangements. "Mitchell, thank you for coming. Please sit down." Admiral Reynolds gestured to the same chair Sarah had occupied during their previous meeting. "I hope you've had time to process our conversation earlier this week." "Yes, ma'am. I've been thinking about what you told me, and I've been considering some of the possibilities you mentioned." Admiral Reynolds nodded approvingly. "Good. I've been doing some thinking as well, and I'd like to discuss a proposition with you." She picked up one of the personnel files from her desk. "This station handles logistics and support for special operations units throughout the region. Those operations depend on precise coordination between multiple military branches, complex supply chains, and rapid response capabilities." Sarah listened carefully, trying to understand where the conversation was heading. Currently, that coordination is managed by several different departments with different priorities and different communication protocols. The result is sometimes inefficient, occasionally problematic, and potentially dangerous if critical supplies or information don't reach operational units when needed. Admiral Reynolds paused and looked directly at Sarah. "Your background gives you a unique perspective on both the operational requirements of Special Forces units and the logistical challenges of meeting those requirements. You understand what teams need in the field because you've been part of those teams and you understand supply management because you've been working in that field for 8 years. Sarah began to see where the conversation might be leading. Are you suggesting some kind of liaison role between operations and logistics? I'm suggesting something more significant than a liaison role. I'm suggesting that you develop and lead a new coordination system that integrates operational planning with logistics support from the earliest stages of mission development. The proposition was both exciting and overwhelming. Sarah could immediately see the value of such a system. She had experienced firsthand how logistical problems could compromise operational success. But she could also see how complex and demanding such a responsibility would be. Admiral, that sounds like the kind of position that would require significant authority to make decisions and implement changes. I'm not sure I'm qualified for that level of responsibility. Admiral Reynolds stood up and walked to the window. Mitchell, let me tell you about a conversation I had with your current supervisor, Chief Petty Officer Martinez, earlier this week. He told me that you've identified 17 different inefficiencies in supply chain management since you started working here. He also told me that your suggestions for addressing those inefficiencies have saved the station approximately $200,000 in operational costs. Sarah was surprised to learn that anyone had been paying attention to her suggestions. She had submitted them through routine channels, but hadn't expected them to be implemented or tracked. He also told me, Admiral Reynolds continued, that you have an unusual ability to anticipate requirements before they become urgent needs. Last month, you identified a potential shortage of medical supplies 3 weeks before it would have affected operational readiness. That was just based on patterns I noticed in requisition requests, Sarah said. It wasn't anything complicated. Admiral Reynolds turned back to face her. Mitchell, pattern recognition and predictive analysis are exactly the skills that make someone qualified for strategic coordination responsibilities. The fact that you don't recognize the significance of your own abilities doesn't make those abilities less valuable. Sarah felt the familiar fear of being asked to do more than she thought she was capable of. But for the first time in 8 years, she also felt something else, curiosity about whether she might actually be capable of more than she had allowed herself to attempt. What would this position involve specifically? Sarah asked. Admiral Reynolds returned to her desk and picked up a folder labeled Operational Logistics Integration Program, Draft Proposal. She handed the folder to Sarah and sat down. The position would be called Special Operations Logistics Coordinator. You would work directly with operational commanders during mission planning to identify logistical requirements, potential supply chain vulnerabilities, and backup resource options. You would also be responsible for developing protocols that ensure critical supplies reach operational units on schedule and according to specifications. Sarah opened the folder and scanned the detailed job description. The responsibilities were substantial and would require her to interact with high-ranking officers, make decisions that could affect mission success, and take ownership of outcomes in ways she had avoided for years. This would be a completely different kind of work than what I've been doing, Sarah said. Yes, it would. It would also be work that matches your actual qualifications rather than work that hides them. Admiral Reynolds reached across the desk and picked up the Medal of Honor from the display of items from the hidden box. She held it up so that it caught the light from the office windows. Mitchell, this medal represents recognition for extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming odds. But heroism isn't just about what you do in extreme situations. Heroism is also about using your abilities to serve something larger than yourself, even when that service requires you to take risks or accept responsibilities you find uncomfortable. She set the medal down and continued. You have abilities that could improve operational readiness and potentially save lives in future operations. The question is whether you're willing to use those abilities or whether you're going to continue hiding them in storage rooms. Sarah stared at the Medal of Honor and thought about the woman she had been 23 years earlier. That woman hadn't hesitated to take command when leadership was needed. She hadn't waited for someone else to volunteer for dangerous assignments. She had seen what needed to be done and had done it, regardless of her own fears or limitations. But that woman had also made decisions that resulted in people being injured or killed. She had experienced failures that haunted her dreams for years. She had learned that leadership often meant accepting responsibility for outcomes beyond anyone's control. "Admiral," Sarah said slowly, "I appreciate the confidence you're showing in me, but I need to be honest about something. Part of the reason I chose my current assignment was to avoid the kind of responsibilities where my decisions could affect other people's safety. I'm not sure I'm ready to take that risk again." Admiral Reynolds nodded understandingly. "That's a legitimate concern, Mitchell. Leadership always involves risk, and anyone who takes on significant responsibilities will eventually face situations where their decisions have serious consequences." She paused and seemed to consider her next words carefully. "But let me ask you this. Do you think avoiding responsibility eliminates risk, or does it just transfer that risk to other people who may be less qualified to handle it?" The question struck Sarah like a physical blow. She had never considered that her choice to avoid leadership roles might be putting other people at risk. She had thought of her decision as self-protection, not as a way of passing dangerous responsibilities to others. "I hadn't thought about it that way," Sarah admitted. "The logistics coordination problems I mentioned earlier aren't abstract issues, Mitchell. They're problems that affect real operations and real people. Last year, a special operations team in the Middle East had to extend a dangerous mission by 18 hours because critical communications equipment didn't arrive on schedule. 3 team members were wounded during that extended operation." Admiral Reynolds let that information sink in before continuing. "I can't prove that better logistics coordination would have prevented those injuries, but I can say with confidence that the current system has gaps that could be addressed by someone with your background and abilities." Sarah looked at the job description again, this time focusing on specific responsibilities rather than general concerns about authority and risk. The work would be challenging, but it would also be meaningful in ways that her current assignment was not. And it would use skills and knowledge that she had spent years developing but had been deliberately neglecting. "If I were to consider this position," Sarah said carefully, "what kind of support would be available? I would need training on current operational protocols, and I would need guidance on military procedures I haven't used in 8 years. Admiral Reynolds smiled, recognizing that Sarah was beginning to seriously consider the opportunity. Full training support would be provided, including advanced courses in operational planning and logistics management. You would also be assigned a mentor, an experienced officer who could provide guidance during your transition to the new role. She picked up another document from her desk. "There's one more thing, Mitchell. This position would come with a promotion to Chief Petty Officer and eventually Senior Chief Petty Officer, depending on your performance. It would also be a pathway to potential commissioning as an officer if you decided to pursue that option in the future." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of what Admiral Reynolds was proposing. The opportunity represented everything she had avoided for 8 years: visibility, responsibility, and the possibility of significant impact on military operations. But it also represented something she had almost forgotten she had once wanted: the chance to use her abilities in service of something important, to be part of missions that mattered, and to work at the level of her actual capabilities rather than hiding those capabilities from herself and others. "Admiral, I need some time to think about this. It's a much bigger decision than I expected to be making when I found that box in Storage Room C." "Of course. Take whatever time you need. But Mitchell..." Admiral Reynolds stood up and walked around the desk to where Sarah was sitting. "Whatever you decide about this specific opportunity, I hope you'll remember what you learned about yourself this week. You're not just someone who organizes supplies. You're someone who has already proven capable of extraordinary courage and leadership. That doesn't change just because you choose not to use those qualities." Sarah left Admiral Reynolds' office with the job description folder under her arm, and her mind spinning with possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to consider in years. As she walked back toward her current workstation, she realized that regardless of what she decided about the logistics coordinator position, she was no longer the same person who had been contentedly organizing ammunition boxes just a week earlier. The woman who had hidden her Medal of Honor in Storage Room C had been trying to protect her from the weight of her own potential. But that protection had come at a cost. The cost of becoming smaller than she actually was, of settling for work that used only a fraction of her abilities, and of convincing herself that avoiding risk was the same as finding safety. Sarah wasn't sure yet what she wanted to do with the knowledge Admiral Reynolds had given her about her past heroism and her current capabilities. But she was beginning to understand that hiding from herself wasn't actually protecting her from anything except the possibility of becoming the person she was meant to be. Sarah spent the weekend reviewing the job description Admiral Reynolds had given her and researching everything she could find about current special operations logistics protocols. What she discovered both excited and intimidated her. The military had evolved significantly during her 8 years in supply management, with new technologies, updated procedures, and complex coordination requirements that hadn't existed during her earlier service. But she also recognized patterns and challenges that were fundamentally unchanged from her experience with Operation Silent Thunder. Special operations teams still needed precisely the right equipment at exactly the right time, and logistical failures still had the potential to compromise mission success and endanger lives. By Sunday evening, Sarah had made a tentative decision to accept Admiral Reynolds' offer. The work would be demanding and would require her to step outside the comfortable boundaries she had established for herself, but it would also allow her to apply her unique combination of operational and logistical experience in ways that could genuinely improve mission readiness. She planned to speak with Admiral Reynolds on Monday morning to discuss next steps and timeline for transitioning to the new role. But Monday morning brought an emergency that changed everything. Sarah arrived at work at her usual time and found the base in an elevated state of alert. Military police were stationed at checkpoints throughout the facility, and personnel were being restricted to essential activities only. When she reached her supervisor's office, Chief Petty Officer Martinez explained the situation with visible tension. "We've got a special operations team that's been compromised during a mission overseas," Martinez told her. "They need immediate resupply, but the standard logistics channels can't get equipment to them fast enough. Command is looking for alternative solutions, and they need them by 1400 hours. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What kind of equipment do they need? Medical supplies, primarily. The team medic was injured during initial contact, and they've got wounded personnel who need treatment beyond basic field medicine. They also need specialized communications equipment because their primary systems were damaged." Martinez showed Sarah the official request, which included technical specifications for the required supplies and geographic constraints that limited delivery options. Sarah immediately recognized the complexity of the challenge. The team was in a location that couldn't be reached by normal supply aircraft. The required medical equipment was specialized and not readily available in standard inventory, and the timeline for delivery was extremely tight. "Who's been assigned to coordinate the resupply?" Sarah asked. "Lieutenant Commander Peterson from the Logistics Department. He's been working on it since 0600, but he's having trouble finding equipment that meets the specifications." Sarah knew Peterson by reputation. He was competent and thorough, but his experience was primarily with routine supply operations rather than emergency logistics for special operations. She also knew that the medical supplies the team needed were available, but not through standard channels. "Chief, I might be able to help with this," Sarah said. "I have experience with the medical equipment they're requesting, and I know some alternative supply sources that might not be obvious." Martinez looked surprised. "Mitchell, this is way outside your normal responsibilities. Peterson has years of experience with complex logistics coordination. I understand that, but I also understand what that team is dealing with in the field. Sometimes alternative perspectives can identify solutions that standard procedures miss." Sarah was making a decision even as she spoke. The situation was exactly the kind of high-pressure, high-stakes challenge that she had been avoiding for 8 years. But it was also a situation where her unique background could potentially save lives, and hiding from responsibility no longer seemed like an acceptable option. Martinez considered her offer for a moment, then nodded. "All right, Mitchell, go talk to Peterson and see if you can contribute something useful. But remember, this is his operation and his authority." Sarah found Lieutenant Commander Peterson in the Logistics Operations Center, surrounded by computer screens, communication equipment, and stacks of supply catalogs. He looked frustrated and exhausted despite the early hour. "Lieutenant Commander Peterson, I'm Petty Officer Mitchell from Supply Management. Chief Martinez thought I might be able to assist with the emergency resupply operation. Peterson looked up from the computer screen where he had been searching inventory databases. Mitchell, I appreciate the offer, but this is a complex special operations logistics problem. I'm not sure how supply management experience would apply. Sarah recognized the dismissive tone and realized that Peterson saw her as someone trying to interfere with work beyond her qualifications. She also realized that explaining her background would require revealing information about her previous military service that she had kept private for 8 years. Sir, I understand your concerns, but I have experience with the specific medical equipment your team is requesting, and I might know supply sources that aren't included in standard databases. Peterson gestured to the computer screen. I've been through every medical supply vendor in our system. The equipment they need isn't available for immediate delivery. The closest option would take 36 hours to reach the staging area, which is 22 hours beyond our deadline. Sarah looked at the equipment specifications Peterson had been searching for. She recognized most of the items from her medical training and remembered that similar equipment had been used during Operation Silent Thunder. Lieutenant Commander, what about emergency medical supplies maintained by special operations units for their own use? Those wouldn't appear in general inventory databases, but special ops units sometimes have reserve equipment that could be made available for emergency situations. Peterson paused his computer search and looked at Sarah with more interest. How would you know about special operations medical reserves? Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would require her to reveal more about her background than she had shared with anyone at the base. Because I used to work with special operations units, sir. I was a Navy corpsman assigned to special operations teams before I transferred to supply management. Peterson's entire demeanor changed. You were assigned to special ops? Why didn't you mention that in your initial introduction? Because it wasn't relevant to my current duties, sir. But it might be relevant to this situation. Peterson turned away from his computer and gave Sarah his full attention. All right, Mitchell, what do you suggest? Sarah moved to the communications equipment and began searching for contact information for special operations units in the region. Special ops units maintain emergency medical kits that include the equipment your team needs. If we can contact units that aren't currently deployed, they might be able to transfer supplies for emergency use. She found the contact information she was looking for and showed Peterson the communication protocols for reaching special operations commanders. These units have rapid deployment capabilities and could potentially get supplies to your team much faster than conventional logistics channels. Peterson looked skeptical. Mitchell, these units aren't under our command authority. We can't just requisition their equipment. No, sir, but we can explain the emergency situation and request assistance. Special operations units have informal support networks that function outside normal command structures. They help each other when standard protocols can't meet operational requirements. Sarah realized she was drawing on knowledge from her earlier military service that she hadn't accessed in years. But the emergency situation had triggered memories and insights that felt as current as if she had been working with special operations just last week. Peterson made the decision to try Sarah's suggestion. While he worked on identifying appropriate special operations units to contact, Sarah focused on the communications equipment problem. The team needed specialized radio systems that could operate in the electromagnetic environment where they were located. Sarah remembered that similar communications challenges had been encountered during Operation Silent Thunder, and she knew that certain equipment manufacturers maintained emergency replacement inventories specifically for special operations use. Lieutenant Commander, for the communications equipment, we might want to contact Tactical Communications Systems directly. They maintain emergency replacement stocks for special operations, and they have rapid deployment capabilities. Peterson looked up from his computer. TCS isn't in our vendor database. How do you know about them? They provided emergency replacement equipment for special operations teams I worked with during previous deployments. They specialize in situations exactly like this one. Sarah provided Peterson with contact information for TCS that she remembered from years earlier, hoping that the company still maintained the same emergency support protocols. While Peterson made the call, Sarah continued searching for additional supply sources that might not be obvious to someone without special operations experience. Over the next 2 hours, Sarah and Peterson worked together to develop a comprehensive resupply plan that drew on resources from multiple sources. Special operations units in 3 different locations agreed to provide medical supplies from their emergency reserves. Tactical communications systems confirmed they could provide replacement radio equipment and deliver it to the staging area within 8 hours. And Sarah identified a civilian medical supply company that specialized in trauma care equipment and could provide backup supplies if the military sources fell through. By 1,000 hours, they had a complete logistics plan that would get all required supplies to the compromised special operations team within their deadline. But implementing the plan required coordination between multiple military units, civilian contractors, and transportation assets spread across 2 time zones. Peterson looked at Sarah with a mixture of respect and exhaustion. "Mitchell, this plan will work, but it's going to require constant coordination and troubleshooting for the next 6 hours. Are you prepared to stay involved until the supplies reach the team?" Sarah realized that Peterson was essentially asking her to take on operational responsibility for the success of the entire resupply mission. 6 months earlier, such a request would have terrified her. But now, thinking about the special operations team that needed help and the wounded personnel who were depending on their success, her answer was immediate. "Yes, sir. I'm prepared to see this through." What followed was the most demanding 6 hours Sarah had experienced since leaving special operations. She and Peterson divided responsibility for different aspects of the coordination effort, with Sarah managing communications with special operations units and civilian contractors while Peterson handled military transportation and command reporting. Throughout the afternoon, they encountered the kinds of problems that made emergency logistics so challenging. One of the special operations units discovered that some of their reserve medical supplies had expired and needed to be replaced. The civilian communications equipment company encountered transportation delays that threatened to push their delivery beyond the deadline. Weather conditions at the staging area changed, requiring adjustments to aircraft routing and delivery procedures. Each problem required immediate problem solving and often creative solutions that weren't covered by standard procedures. Sarah found herself drawing on knowledge and experience she hadn't used in years, but also discovering that her 8 years of supply management experience had given her additional insights into logistics coordination that she hadn't possessed during her earlier military service. The most critical moment came at 1,330 hours, when they learned that the aircraft carrying the medical supplies had encountered mechanical problems and would be delayed by at least 2 hours. The Special Operations Team's deadline was 1,400 hours, and any delay beyond that point could jeopardize the mission and the lives of wounded personnel. Peterson looked at the updated timeline and shook his head. "We're not going to make it, Mitchell. The medical supplies are the most critical items, and there's no way to get them to the staging area by 1400. Sarah studied the transportation routing and realized that there might be an alternative approach that could still meet the deadline. "Lieutenant Commander, what if we reroute the medical supplies to a different staging area that's closer to the team's location?" The original staging area was selected based on standard transportation protocols, but special operations teams have flexibility in their extraction procedures. Peterson looked at the map Sarah was indicating. That staging area doesn't have the facilities for complex medical equipment transfers. It doesn't need complex facilities if we modify the delivery procedures. Special operations teams are trained to receive supplies in austere environments. They can handle equipment that's delivered in basic containers rather than specialized transportation systems. Sarah was proposing to completely change the delivery methodology 30 minutes before the deadline, which violated every principle of safe logistics management. But she was also proposing a solution that could save the mission and potentially save lives. Peterson made the decision to implement Sarah's alternative plan. While he contacted the Special Operations Team to coordinate the new delivery procedures, Sarah worked with the aircraft crew to modify their approach to the revised staging area. At 1,355 hours, 5 minutes before the deadline, they received confirmation that the medical supplies and communications equipment had been successfully delivered to the Special Operations Team. The wounded personnel were receiving treatment. The team had re-established communications with command, and the mission could continue as planned. Peterson turned to Sarah with an expression that mixed relief, exhaustion, and genuine respect. "Mitchell, I couldn't have made this work without your input. Your knowledge of special operations procedures and alternative supply sources made the difference between success and failure." Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was exhausted from 6 hours of high-pressure coordination work, but she was also exhilarated by the knowledge that her efforts had directly contributed to saving lives and completing a critical mission. For the first time in 8 years, she had worked at the level of her actual capabilities, and the results had exceeded what she had thought possible. But more importantly, she had proven to herself that her earlier heroism hadn't been a one-time occurrence during unique circumstances. When faced with a new challenge that required her to step outside her comfort zone and accept significant responsibility, she had responded with the same courage and competence she had shown during Operation Silent Thunder. As Peterson compiled his after-action report for submission to command, Sarah realized that she no longer needed to wonder whether she was capable of accepting the logistics coordination position Admiral Reynolds had offered. The day's events had demonstrated that she not only could handle such responsibilities, but that she could excel at them. The woman who had spent 8 years organizing ammunition boxes was gone, replaced by someone who was ready to embrace the full scope of her abilities and accept the responsibilities that came with them. Sarah Mitchell was finally ready to stop hiding from herself and start becoming the person she was meant to be. 3 weeks after the emergency resupply operation, Sarah stood in Admiral Reynolds' office wearing dress blues she hadn't put on in over 8 years. The uniform felt different now, not like a costume she was wearing to fulfill military obligations, but like clothing that actually belonged to her. The emergency logistics coordination had generated significant attention throughout the command structure. Sarah's innovative approach to the supply crisis had not only saved the Special Operations mission, but had also identified systematic improvements that could prevent similar emergencies in the future. Word of her performance had reached senior officers throughout the region, and several had requested her involvement in their own logistics planning. But it was the quiet conversation she'd had with Admiral Reynolds the morning after the emergency that had truly changed everything. "Mitchell," Admiral Reynolds had said, "yesterday you proved something that I suspected but couldn't verify through observation alone. Under pressure, when lives were at stake and conventional solutions weren't working, you naturally took command of the situation and applied precisely the kind of innovative leadership that earned you the Medal of Honor 23 years ago." Sarah had understood that the emergency had served as more than just a test of her technical knowledge. It had been a demonstration of whether her heroism was still accessible when circumstances required it. Now, standing in Admiral Reynolds' office for what she knew would be their final formal meeting, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since the day she discovered the hidden box in Storage Room C. She had accepted the position of Special Operations Logistics Coordinator and had already begun the advanced training that would prepare her for her new responsibilities. More importantly, she had begun the process of integrating her past heroism with her current identity instead of trying to keep them separate. "Are you ready for this, Mitchell?" Admiral Reynolds asked, gesturing toward the formal presentation setup that had been arranged in the office. Sarah nodded, though she felt nervous in a way that had nothing to do with fear or self-doubt. Today, 23 years after it had been awarded, she would officially receive the Congressional Medal of Honor that had been hidden in Storage Room C. The ceremony would be private, witnessed only by Admiral Reynolds and a few senior officers who had security clearance for the classified aspects of Operation Silent Thunder. But the privacy of the ceremony didn't diminish its significance for Sarah. After decades of convincing herself that her heroism had been exaggerated by memory and trauma, she was finally accepting that her actions had been extraordinary and worthy of recognition. "Before we begin," Admiral Reynolds said, "I want you to understand something about why this ceremony is happening now. The geopolitical circumstances that required Operation Silent Thunder to remain classified have changed enough that we can now acknowledge your service. Though certain details must still remain protected." She paused and moved to the window overlooking the base. "But more importantly, You've proven through your recent performance that you're ready to accept this recognition without letting it overwhelm your current life or your future goals. Sarah understood what Admiral Reynolds meant. 3 weeks earlier, receiving the Medal of Honor would have felt like pressure to become someone she wasn't sure she could be. Now it felt like recognition of someone she had always been but had forgotten how to access. Admiral Reynolds returned to her desk and picked up a wooden presentation case that Sarah recognized from the hidden box. The citation was written by the Secretary of Defense and approved by the President in 1999. The medal was struck by the same craftsmen who create all Congressional Medals of Honor. The only thing that's been missing for 23 years has been the presentation. She opened the case to reveal the Medal of Honor, its bronze star catching the office lights exactly as Sarah remembered from that day in Storage Room C. But now, instead of feeling overwhelmed by the weight of recognition she didn't understand, Sarah felt proud of actions she could finally acknowledge as her own. Admiral Reynolds read the formal citation that describes Sarah's heroism during Operation Silent Thunder. Hearing her actions described in official language still felt surreal, but it no longer felt like someone else's story. The woman who had taken command of a compromised special operations mission was the same woman who had coordinated the emergency resupply operation 3 weeks earlier. The courage that had enabled her to call in airstrikes while under enemy fire was the same courage that had enabled her to propose innovative solutions when conventional logistics channels failed. When Admiral Reynolds placed the Medal of Honor around Sarah's neck, Sarah felt the physical weight of the bronze star against her chest. But she also felt something else, the lifting of a psychological weight she had carried for years without realizing it. The weight of believing she was ordinary when she was actually extraordinary. The weight of hiding her capabilities instead of applying them. The weight of thinking that avoiding responsibility was the same as protecting herself. "Congratulations, Senior Chief Mitchell," Admiral Reynolds said, using the rank that would come with Sarah's new position. "This recognition has been 23 years overdue." Sarah looked down at the Medal of Honor and thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a young woman who had saved 47 lives during Operation Silent Thunder, to the supply management technician who had convinced herself she was nobody special, to the logistics coordinator who was ready to apply her abilities in service of something larger than herself. "Admiral," Sarah said, "I want to thank you for more than just this ceremony. You gave me back something I had lost, the ability to see myself clearly. For 8 years, I thought I was protecting myself by becoming smaller than I actually was. But you helped me understand that hiding from my own capabilities wasn't actually keeping me safe." Admiral Reynolds smiled. "Mitchell, you didn't need me to give you back anything. You needed to remember what you already possessed. The heroism that earned this medal didn't disappear when you left Special Operations. It just got applied to different challenges." She gestured toward the logistics coordination materials that covered one corner of her desk. "Your new position will give you opportunities to apply that heroism in ways that can prevent the kinds of crises you helped resolve 3 weeks ago. Instead of responding to emergencies, you'll be anticipating and preventing them." Sarah nodded, understanding that her future work would be different from the dramatic rescue mission that had earned her the Medal of Honor, but no less important. The courage required to improve logistics systems and coordinate complex operations was the same courage that had enabled her to take command during Operation Silent Thunder. The difference was in application, not in fundamental character. "There's one more thing," Admiral Reynolds said, moving to a filing cabinet and removing a thick folder. "I've been authorized to offer you a choice about the public status of your Medal of Honor." Sarah looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "The operational details of Operation Silent Thunder will remain classified.